If we decide to do this thing, we can do it successfully. And there's also no doubt in my mind that the whole world hangs in the balance.
It's a great honor to be here tonight. I sort of consider this building to be kind of the mother church of George Marshall Scholarship. And it's a great honor for me to be here, and I am gratified by the turnout on such a terrible day in terms of the weather. I know that you didn't come because of me. You came because you had the same question in your mind that I did about 2 years ago. What was it about George Marshall and the Red Cross? It's something that his biographers have not paid much attention to. It got me curious, and it also gave me an opportunity to pursue a passion that I have for doing historical research. I started with volume 7 of Marshall's published papers. I expanded that by looking at materials that the American Red Cross provided me. I went to the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, where the Red Cross archives are. I looked at contemporary newspapers of the time, and I spent 2 wonderful days upstairs in this magnificent library to find out more about George Marshall and the American Red Cross. I learned 3 things about Marshall and the Red Cross. One, at the end of Marshall's term as Army Chief of Staff, President Harry Truman's original plan for Marshall was not to go to China, it was not to be Secretary of State, and it was not to be Secretary of Defense. Truman's original plan was the American Red Cross. The second thing was, despite President Truman's assurances to George Marshall that this job would not be very taxing, Marshall worked tirelessly to further the mission of the Red Cross. And 3, I believe that Marshall's Red Cross experience was more satisfying to him personally than anything else that he did. George Marshall was honored at a ceremony at the Pentagon on November 26, 1945. Some people might have called it a retirement ceremony, but that would be technically incorrect, because as a 5-star officer, Marshall never retired. He was considered to be on active duty until he died. He got full pay and allowances, he had a secretary at the Pentagon, and he had an office at the Pentagon. A few weeks before that, President Truman had raised the question, or actually an offer to Marshall, to be president of the American Red Cross. Marshall said he would not, there were 2 parts to his answer. One, he would not take on any such responsibility unless he talked it over with his wife, Catherine. And the second thing he said was, I need a break. I'm not going to do anything for a while, but I might be willing to do it a little bit later. So, the Red Cross presidency, at this event, the Red Cross presidency seemed to be on the horizon, but not the immediate future. That plan was interrupted, however, the very next day, November 27th, 1945. George and Catherine Marshall had gone to Dodona Manor in Leesburg, their home, and were moving in. They drove out from Washington that day. At lunch, they started talking, or at least Catherine, I guess, was doing most of the talking, regaling in what retirement was going to mean. And I can look around and I can see that many of us in this room have had that conversation. No more daily responsibilities. Catherine was so pleased that she planned a special dinner that night to celebrate the change in their lifestyle. Now, at about the same time, and I can't verify this exactly, but to me, was happening at the same time. At the same time they were talking about their future, in Washington, D.C., President Harry Truman and his cabinet were also talking about Marshall's future. Now, if you can imagine a split screen on a video, on one side, you've got the Marshalls are talking, sitting at their lunch, talking about retirement. And on the other part of the screen, you see Truman and his cabinet at a luncheon meeting. Truman had come into that meeting mad as a hornet. Now, there are some accounts which said that he probably said, "Look what that SOB has done." I don't think he used the abbreviation. He was talking about Patrick Hurley, who had been the ambassador to China. He was back in the United States. On the previous day, he and Truman had had a meeting. Hurley was mad. He claimed that the people in the State Department were undermining his efforts in China. But Truman thought he had calmed him down. But that morning, Hurley issued a statement to the press saying he was resigning as ambassador to China, and he charged the State Department and the rest of the Truman administration with undermining his efforts. So the cabinet was faced with the question, how do we overcome the negative reaction to Hurley's statement? And they eventually concluded that what Truman needed to do was appoint a person to take Hurley's place, a person with impeccable reputation, and a well-regarded national figure. Now, who else would that be? Clinton Anderson, the Secretary of Agriculture, suggested Marshall's name, and James Forrestal, Secretary of the Navy, seconded the idea. Now, Truman was initially opposed to the idea because he remembered what Marshall had said. He didn't want to do anything right away. But Truman was persuaded by two arguments from the cabinet. One, Truman could appoint him as special envoy, not ambassador, and that would eliminate the need for Senate hearings and a confirmation. And Marshall could leave for China immediately. The second argument from cabinet members was that Marshall would have to spend only a few months in China, make a token appearance and a token effort, and come home. Now, we all know he didn't do that. He stayed in China for a year. He came back. He was not successful in what he was trying to do. So, let's imagine that split screen again. On the one side, Catherine Marshall is walking up the steps at Dodona Manor to go to her bedroom to take a nap. On the other side of the screen, we see President Truman making a phone call to George Marshall to ask him to go to China. Despite what Marshall had said, I won't do it unless I talk to Catherine, and I won't do it right away. Marshall said yes immediately, and he left for China within 3 weeks. He left for China before Christmas. He was there for a year, came back in early 1947, and immediately became Secretary of State, served in that capacity for 2 years. And finally then, in January of 1949, after he had had kidney surgery and resigned as Secretary of State, he and Catherine went to Pinehurst, North Carolina, to their second home in Pinehurst. Truman visited him shortly after that on January 13th. When the President walked into his bedroom, Marshall said, "My goodness, where did you come from?" The two men talked for 45 minutes, and they almost certainly talked about the Red Cross position. 2 days later, the Marshalls flew to Puerto Rico on the President's airplane, and they came back on February 7th, also on the airplane, President's airplane. Shortly after he returned, Truman asked Marshall to come to the White House and again asked him to assume the Red Cross presidency. Marshall told Truman the Red Cross presented by far the most satisfying opportunity, especially in contrast to the duties and responsibilities of war. On September 22nd, Truman announced Marshall's appointment to a 3-year term as president of the American Red Cross, effective October 1st. And that, by the way, is the charter of the Red Cross says the President of the United States appoints the President of the Red Cross. So this is a photograph taken on October 3rd, 1949, with President Truman, George Marshall, and Basil O'Connor, who was Marshall's predecessor at the American Red Cross. The appointment of the 68-year-old Marshall generated favorable comments in the nation's newspapers. The New York Times said that Marshall gave the Red Cross a leader of dignity and highest character, skilled in the organization and direction of great enterprises. He brings a new prestige to a fine organization and continues his tradition of service to his country. The New York Herald Tribune said, "Heartwarming is an overworked adjective, but it is the best we know to express the spontaneous, popular feeling that welcomes him to his new post." Now, it's probable that the income, the added income from the Red Cross position, may have influenced Marshall's decision. This was Marshall's income in 1949. You see the annual income from his 5-star general, being a 5-star general, about $18,700. As Red Cross, he earned $22,500 for a total annual salary of about $41,000. In today's dollars, probably $450,000. Scores of Red Cross workers assembled here. This is the magnificent Red Cross building in downtown Washington. They assembled there on October 3rd to await the arrival of their new president. According to the Red Cross Courier, the organization's magazine, the general's face broke into a broad smile as he acknowledged the greetings by nodding left and right. With characteristic modesty, he was touched by the salute. And I think this is one of those pictures you see. I've seen a lot of pictures of George Marshall in various capacities. Seeing a picture with him smiling that way in an official capacity, I think is pretty rare. Truman had promised Marshall that the job would not be too taxing, a fact that Marshall had acknowledged in a note to Truman, saying, "I appreciate your desire to provide me with a dignified post that would not be too demanding for my health and peace of mind." Marshall and Truman may have believed that the Red Cross responsibilities would not be too taxing, but the realities of Marshall's duties were far different, because George Marshall's nature would not allow him to be a mere figurehead in the office. Within 3 weeks, the new Red Cross president began a grueling trip to inspect Red Cross facilities and meet leaders and volunteers across the country. As he left on that trip, he told reporters, "This trip is an effort to hear and to see, not to talk. I'm not going to discuss war. I've been talking war for 10 years and I'm fed up. I'm talking Red Cross." The details of that trip show how extensive and exhaustive it was. He left on October 24th, flew to Pittsburgh for lunch, to Cleveland for dinner, and then to Chicago, where he spent the night. And of course, what is not in this is the various meetings he had as he was visiting. On the 25th, it was luncheon in Chicago, flew to Minneapolis for a visit and a dinner, and then on to Bismarck to spend the night. On the 26th, he flew more than 1,000 miles through heavy fog to Portland for dinner and on to San Francisco for the night and a reunion with his good old friend, General Hap Arnold. On the 27th, it was lunch in San Francisco, Los Angeles for dinner, and Phoenix for the night. Wow. On the 28th, Kansas City, St. Louis, and Memphis. And finally, on the 29th, flew to New Orleans for a luncheon, Atlanta for dinner, and he returned to Washington by train. Marshall later said, and I've seen the schedule, it was down to the minute in every city. The people he was supposed to meet, where he was supposed to be. He bragged about the fact he was late only once on that trip. It was 12 minutes in New Orleans. He said, I can take that delay because it was at Antoine's restaurant. Marshall on that trip flew in a converted B-26 Martin airplane, one similar to this. Journalists who accompanied him or who covered him as he made that trip were impressed by his vigor because they thought he might have been weakened by his kidney operation. The San Francisco Chronicle said he whisked in and out of San Francisco yesterday with a gleam in his eye and a bounce in his step. He whooshed away to complete an itinerary that ought to have had him on the ropes, but which obviously hasn't laid a glove on him. A Memphis newspaper said Marshall was militarily erect in a soft blue suit, a darker blue tie, and a brown topcoat. The eyes that had watched over the nation's victory in war and its foreign policy in peace were bright and full of humor. When he saw people lining a parade route, he exclaimed, "Why, this is terrible. All these people came here to see me, and I'm here riding in a car. Let's get out and walk." And that's what he did. A Youngstown, Ohio newspaper said that Marshall's troops in the war had always found him plain, unassuming, and considerate. The people of Youngstown expected their famous guest to be riding in pomp and splendor. They didn't look for him to be walking like an ordinary man. General Marshall doesn't try to look different from other men. The difference is in what he does. Marshall took a second trip in January of 1950. Boston, Providence, Jacksonville, Tampa, Montgomery, Birmingham, Houston, Dallas, Oklahoma City, Wichita, Nashville, and Louisville. A third trip in February, Buffalo, Detroit, Toledo, Indianapolis, Cincinnati, Philadelphia, New York City, Newark, New Orleans, Los Angeles, Honolulu, and San Francisco. At a news conference on that trip, Marshall said he had no other plans for the future and that the Red Cross would be his last public effort. A New York Times story about Marshall's extensive travels for the Red Cross prompted one reader to write to Marshall. And I found that letter here in the archives. It was a folded piece of notepaper with just a couple of words at the top. The White House, Washington, D.C. It was a note, handwritten note from President Truman. In that note, Truman said, "As usual, you are doing a thorough job." He advised Marshall to be careful of his health and physical well-being, and he continued, "I want you to be alive and fit when I quit here so we can do some things that need to be done in this great country of ours. Please take care of yourself. Don't make me responsible for your demise. I have enough to answer for without that." And you know, one of the great joys of this kind of research is you get to touch things like this. It was a piece of notepaper that President Harry Truman had held when he wrote that note. And it was the same piece of paper that George Marshall held when he read that note. Marshall's transportation needs in Washington were met by a Studebaker Land Cruiser, similar to this one, that Harold Vance, head of the Studebaker Corporation, had provided for Marshall's use. Marshall told Vance, "It's a beautiful car, and I'm deriving much pleasure from it." Now, so why did Marshall engage in such exhaustive travel, especially in light of Truman's promise that the job would not be too taxing? I found some answers in an undated and confidential memo here in the library upstairs. It was headed, "Some Problems of Red Cross, Memorandum for General Marshall, for his eyes only." No indication of who the author was and no indication of when it was written. One problem was low morale among Red Cross employees and volunteers at local chapter levels. The organization's had a national body called the Board of Incorporators. It included 65 people, mostly from the East Coast, and most of them wealthy supporters of the Red Cross. If one member died or left the committee, the other members of the incorporators picked a successor. There was an 18-member central committee that really ran the organization. It consisted of 6 government officials appointed by the President of the United States, 6 representatives of local chapters around the country, and 6 members of the Board of Incorporators. Now, the government officials considered their appointment to be largely honorary, and they didn't participate very much. People from local chapters found it difficult to travel to Washington on a regular basis, and they didn't come very much, meaning the 6 members from the Board of Incorporators were the ones who dominated the Central Committee. And that's what was causing the friction between national and local. A reorganization in 1947 had alleviated some of those problems, but the negative feelings persisted. George Marshall had a solution for this. He said, "I know from my Army experience that you've got to go to the people themselves to find out what the problems are." And that's what led him to visit all of those Red Cross chapters and volunteers. Another problem was growing pains and then shrinking pains that the Red Cross had experienced before, during, and after the war. And you can see this, that before the war there were about 3,500 paid employees. During the height of the war in 1944 and 1945, it had jumped to more than 25,000 paid employees, and it had dropped in 1946 and 1947. But the drop in expenditures did not correspond to the drop in its activities. Finances were a constant challenge to the Red Cross and for Marshall. The organization had received some government funding during the war. It continued to receive some government funding, but it had been cut back after the war. The memo said that the Red Cross had substantially overspent its income after the war because its expenses did not drop as much as its income did. Soon after taking office, Marshall launched a nationwide campaign to try to raise $67 million, approximately $700 million today. He appeared on national radio programs. He appeared on the Arthur Godfrey Show. On one program, he introduced President Truman, and he had this to say about the Red Cross. Its nearly 4,000 chapters touch every region of America. Its thousands of volunteers represent the finest quality of Americanism. The workers of the Red Cross belong to no one group, race, or creed. Its ranks include the man in the street, and the man in the White House. Marshall also had to contend with some negative attitudes in the public toward the Red Cross. Now, I know it's kind of hard to imagine anybody being critical of the Red Cross for what it had done. But there were some negative feelings among soldiers from World War II and also their families. And those attitudes had persisted, and Marshall had to deal with those. They arose, Marshall said, because the average soldier during the war did not understand the functions of the Red Cross and how military restrictions might have imposed upon Red Cross activities. He had to explain why the Red Cross had charged soldiers for meals and other things at its facilities. That came not because of the Red Cross, but because of a directive by Secretary of War Henry Stimson, who said that soldiers from other Allied countries had to pay when they went to their comparable facilities, and it would have been a morale problem if they didn't have to pay, if Americans didn't have to pay. He was adamant, however, in declaring that the Red Cross never charged for blood. Other soldiers complained that the Red Cross hadn't given them loans. One of the things the Red Cross did was provide loans, emergency loan, interest-free loans for soldiers. Some soldiers complained, well, I applied for one of these and I never got it. And that gave them a negative attitude. Marshall pointed out that during the war, the American Red Cross had given out $74 million in emergency loans. But even that wasn't enough, and sometimes there wasn't enough money to go around. The Red Cross also played a role in notifying soldiers of an emergency or probably a death at home. And the Red Cross would notify a soldier's commanding officer. In some cases, the soldier was able to go back to the States because of that emergency. But some soldiers complained that the Red Cross hadn't given them a leave when they emergency leave. Well, the Red Cross authority, the Red Cross function was only to notify a commanding officer of the emergency, and the commanding officer had to make that decision. Some soldiers complained about the Red Cross had lost or hadn't carried out its functions of providing emergency communications to soldiers. Marshall pointed out that the Red Cross had handled 42 million such communications. Sometimes they were held up or blocked for security reasons, not because of the Red Cross. In response to another criticism, Marshall explained that paid Red Cross employees received about the same salary as junior officers in the armed forces. Another complaint was that female Red Cross staffers paid more attention to officers than they did to enlisted men. Marshall explained with tongue in cheek that the Red Cross had only one female staffer for every 15,000 soldiers, and that led to a perception that there was a shortage. Further, with his tongue in his cheek, he said, about the only solution would have been to have had a ratio of one female Red Cross worker to every soldier, and that was impractical. Marshall said that the problems of the Red Cross arose in part because volunteers did not understand its role. And the answer, he said, was to educate Red Cross workers about the Red Cross, what it meant and how it operated. Simply stated, he said, the solution is to know the Red Cross. And that statement reminded me of something that Marshall had been responsible for during World War II, when he concluded that a lot of soldiers didn't understand why we were fighting. And that led Marshall to commission the production of the motion picture series, Why We Fight. He was an untiring champion of the Red Cross blood collection program and promoted it wherever he could. He said that the importance of the Red Cross to the morale and well-being of soldiers and veterans had been a compelling reason for his taking the Red Cross presidency. The Red Cross, he said, was an understanding counselor and ever-present friend, working with the military, not a part of it. The Red Cross was important domestically, Marshall said, and its medical services were the organization's most valuable contribution to the nation. In towns of fewer than 10,000 people, he said, the Red Cross was the only active social agency. Marshall said that the Red Cross's disaster relief was better appreciated and understood than any of its other services. In the finest sense, he says, this service exemplifies the time-honored American tradition of neighbor helping neighbor. Marshall emphasized the importance of volunteers to Red Cross efforts, and he especially lamented the lack of attention paid to women volunteers and the Junior Red Cross. George Marshall had said that he had no personal plans beyond the Red Cross. But events in Korea in 1950 changed that. After North Korea invaded South Korea on June 25th, President Truman would again call on George Marshall for yet another assignment. 4 important visitors came to see Marshall in Leesburg on Saturday, July 1st. Dean Acheson, Secretary of State, Averell Harriman, Special Assistant to President Truman, Charles Bolin, Special Advisor to Acheson, and George Kennan, another Special Advisor in the State Department. Now, as I think about those 4 men riding in a limousine or a car out to Dodona Manor to meet with George Marshall, I'm tempted to paraphrase something that President Kennedy said about Nobel Prize winners at the White House. This was the most extraordinary talent that had ever been gathered at Dodona Manor, with the possible exception of when George Marshall dined alone. In Marshall's words, the 4 men showed up down at Leesburg and stayed for lunch. And you can imagine the character of the discussion. They concluded that President Truman should hear Marshall's ideas too. The President telephoned Marshall the next day, Sunday, July 2nd, and invited him to come to Washington on the day after the 4th of July. Truman couldn't wait, however. On the morning of July 4th, he got Marshall out of bed with a phone call. It was an hour's notice saying that he and his daughter Margaret were on their way to Leesburg and they would be there to talk to Marshall. In addition to hearing Marshall's views about the Korea situation, Truman wanted to confirm that Marshall was physically able and willing to become Secretary of Defense. Marshall later told a friend of his predicament that day, "Most confidentially, I have been trembling on the edge of being called again into public service in this crisis, but I hope to get by unmolested. But," he continued, "when the President sits under our oak trees and tells me of his difficulties, he has me at a disadvantage." 2 months later, Truman asked Marshall to replace Lewis Johnson as Secretary of Defense. The Senate confirmed Marshall's appointment on September 21st, and he took office that day. Truman sent Catherine the pen that he had used to sign the appointment and included this note: "I wish for your sake and the general's that this meant less work instead of more for him." After 2 months of serving concurrently as Secretary of Defense and President of the Red Cross, Marshall resigned the Red Cross presidency because he could not do both and because the Red Cross needed an active leader. In a farewell speech to Red Cross volunteers in Cleveland, Marshall said, "The Red Cross's devotion to peace has not lessened. Its labors to help bring about a better understanding between peoples and nations will not cease. The Red Cross must be a practical, hard-headed organization, vigorous and well-prepared." He said a poignant farewell to the Red Cross staff. "My association with the Red Cross has been a tonic to my spirit. I have learned that there are great reserves of simple goodness and altruism in human beings that, when catalyzed by an agent like the Red Cross, create goodwill, friendliness, and helpfulness. Knowing that these qualities exist, even when dormant, is about the only proof we have that someday man will learn to live in peace." A year later, September 1951, after Marshall had resigned after his agreed-upon 1 year as Secretary of Defense, believe it or not, President Truman came back to him and asked once again for Marshall to serve, going back to his office as President of the Red Cross. Marshall had an answer for him this time. He finally said no. "I am having a fine time doing little or nothing," he said, and Mrs. Marshall appears greatly relaxed. The American Red Cross honors George Marshall with a bust at its headquarters. The only other Red Cross leader so honored is Clara Barton, its founder. As I was preparing these remarks, I started thinking about what if. What if Patrick Hurley hadn't resigned on November 27, 1945, with that statement? Might Marshall have become president of the Red Cross in 1946 and have been so satisfied with that work that he might not have considered being Secretary of State or anything else? Well, you can see where such thinking might lead. I am convinced that George Marshall found great personal satisfaction in his Red Cross work based upon things he said, and here are just a couple of examples. As far as I know, George Marshall never expressed such sentiments about being Chief of Staff of the Army, Special Envoy to China, Secretary of State, or Secretary of Defense. Thank you.